Hi everybody, Timothy Ferris here with a few words about death. For once, no need to define terms. We're all familiar with death. There's a lot of it. About around 65 million people die every year. It's about 2 every second. And yet death is a subject of contention. The difference of opinion has to do not with death itself, but with the question of what, if anything, happens after. One possibility is that heaven awaits us after death. That's the contention of Christianity, the world's most popular religion with over 2 billion adherents. Christians believe that each of us can have everlasting life, and that this everlasting life is to be spent in a place or a state called heaven. The concept of heaven dates back to Sumerian times and shows up in many cultures, and the general idea was that the beauty and seeming order of the stars in the night sky suggested that there might be up there a place of peace and plenty, whereas life on earth was brutal and short, impoverished and violent. So perhaps after you died, at least you stopped suffering the privations that characterized so many people in those early times. Jewish scholars had been writing and talking about the concept of heaven with particular intensity for about 2 centuries prior to the birth of Jesus. Jesus invoked heaven a number of times, particularly in what I think of as his basic recruitment speech, when Jesus would encounter a well-off individual. He would say, "Give away all you have to the poor, come and follow me, and you will find your reward in heaven." Heaven does, however, pose some conundrums. Do you really want to exist forever? Even if it's in heaven, forever is a very long time. In fact, it's even longer than a very long time. It's an infinitely long time. No matter how much time you spent in heaven, you would only have completed an infinitesimal amount of it, an infinite stretch of existence on into the future forever, mandated inescapably for you as an inhabitant of heaven. The man who knew more about time than anyone else of his generation was probably Albert Einstein, who showed that time is pliant and runs faster, shorter, at different accelerations and different gravitational fields. Now, I was interested to note that when the scholar I. Bernard Cohen interviewed Einstein in Princeton on the 18th of April, 1955, just 2 weeks before Einstein's death, Cohen writes this: "I mentioned a quotation from James Frazer, in which he said that the fear of death was the basis of primitive religion, and that to me, that is Cohen, death was both a fact and a mystery." Einstein added, "and also a relief." Another little issue that puzzles me about heaven is that so many people who believe that they'll have an eternal afterlife there talk about how great it'll be to meet their heroes from the past. Some of them ancestors of their own, some of them perhaps relatives that they knew personally and died, but also great historical personae like Shakespeare, Beethoven, Alexander the Great, Abe Lincoln. I just wonder what this does to the social calendars of these famous men and women. I imagine many mathematicians, for instance, would like to meet Hypatia, the female mathematician who was stoned to death by a mob of Christian zealots in the year 415 AD. Does Hypatia have to spend every day dealing with her fans? Does heaven for celebrities represent an eternal backstage meet and greet where every day, keeping in mind that if we exclude the concept of God having created an eternal Auschwitz called hell, that every day something like 65 million people show up in heaven? Does these folks just have to keep going to these meet and greets and answering the same questions over and over again about how did you write that song, or what did that line in the sonnet mean, or how did it feel to be stoned to death by Christian zealots? Might be heaven for the fans. I'm not sure it sounds like heaven for the celebrities. And of course, there's the question that many children ask, which is, do pets go to heaven? What about the other animals, the elephants and the giraffes, the fish in the sea, the beautiful birds? Don't they all come to heaven? I mean, what would it be like without them? And if all of that comes to heaven, Don't we need a stable ecosystem? So that means there also are horse flies and black flies and venomous snakes. If all that's true, then aren't we living in heaven just like we were on earth, except we can never get out? We have to, all of us, remain there forever? So let's move on from the concept of heaven, which I think is best regarded as a marketing tool, and which, like, say, cigarette smoking, used to have adherents when the whole world was relatively poor and uneducated, and which today is being marketed most successfully in those parts of the world that are still relatively poor and uneducated, while belief in heaven and an afterlife has declined sharply in many of the wealthy and better educated states, particularly in Western Europe. There's a secular alternative to heaven, often called by the term near-death experience, and this is based on the reports of many people who have more or less died, typically someone who was on an operating table and his or her heart stopped, and maybe it took a minute or two to get the heart going again and then resuscitate them. And many of these folks report strikingly similar experiences. They see a light in the distance through something like a tunnel. They approach it. They see the faces of their ancestors. Often their whole life flashes before their eyes. And this is presented as evidence that death is not the end and that there is some kind of life after death. I discussed this years ago in a book I wrote about intelligence called The Mind's Sky. And I was intrigued in researching that work to discover that there was a man named Albert Heim who was a geology professor in Zurich and an alpinist, a mountain climber. He had fallen off a glacier at an altitude of 5,900 feet one day in 1871 and survived. And while he was falling, he discovered that he had all these same kind of experiences. His life flashed before his eyes. He saw his relatives. And there was a sense of overwhelming peace that somehow everything was okay. And one of the most encouraging things about near-death experience reports that it's not traumatic. It's very pleasing. Heim reported that while he was falling, everything was transfigured as though by a heavenly light, and everything was beautiful, without grief, without anxiety, and without pain. So Heim became interested in whether other people had similar experiences, so he started interviewing other mountain climbers who had taken falls that might have been fatal, but one or another reason were saved. And this is what I wrote back then about what seems to me one must conclude from all this. Now, a climber falling from a cliff is not dead. He's not even ailing. He is fully fit and is near death only in the sense that he has every reason to expect that he is about to die. Under these circumstances, by the way, just a cascade of chemicals go through the brain, slowing down time so you have more chance of escaping with your life, and all these evolutionarily determined mechanisms for helping you to survive a traumatic, life-threatening event. If, as we have seen, the mental transfigurations he experiences while falling closely resemble modern near-death accounts, then that phenomenon tells us about trauma, not death. And if it doesn't tell us about death, it doesn't tell us about life after death either. We are left then with the most rational alternative, that after death we simply cease to exist. That from a subjective standpoint, after death, one experiences nothingness, including the concept of there being a self. One is simply non-existent. Now, this is a claim that each of us can explore from our own personal experience. The Milky Way galaxy is more than 10 billion years old. The Earth is more than 4 billion years old. Wherever you choose to start the clock, billions of years have passed prior to your birth, during which you did not exist. Was that a problem for you? Were you anguished about it? Did you feel pain over it? Of course not. You had no experience of it because you didn't exist. Same for me. Didn't exist for billions of years. Didn't bother me. This is essentially the Stoic attitude, that you didn't exist before your birth, you won't exist after your death, so don't get hung up about it. The most succinct and truthful summary of this I've ever read was written by Epicurus, the Greek philosopher who died in 270 BC. It's so succinct, I think it's only 7 words in the Latin, that I'll read it first in the Latin and then in a modern translation. Non fui, non sum, non curo. I was not, I was, I am not, I don't care. Hey, thanks for listening. See you next time.